So, good morning and welcome to XRM Virtual. My name is Julie Yak, and I have a couple of quick announcements for us, and then we'll jump right into Joel's presentation about finance and operations. This meeting was actually a special request for me because this is a topic that I know so little on, and in my world, people ask me about it every day. And so I need to know enough to give an intelligent response and know when to call on the experts like Joel and others. So hopefully we'll all have a chance to be interactive. Joel's told me that he very much wants to hear your questions and give you the answers that will help you with what you're looking for. So with that, let's jump in real quick. As you saw, I'm recording this. We'll go ahead and post it to our event page later on today, hopefully. And then we'll also send out a tweet when that recording gets posted. You can go back and reference it to yourself, to your coworkers, send it to your grandma, whatever you need to do. We are always looking for speakers. So right now, this is the last meeting we currently have scheduled, but we all know with release coming up in a couple of weeks, there are all kinds of fun things that we should be talking about. So once we get NDA lift on that, we'll start getting some more topics. If there's something you want to hear or something you want to present, drop me an email, let me know, and we'll get that on the calendar. So some topics that were suggested, but also open to just about anything that you're looking for. So we've got a couple of upcoming events. I am speaking at CRMUG Focus in Indianapolis, as are several of the other friends of the user group. I hope to see some of you there. And then also we've got CRMUG Summit, where the call for speakers is open right now. So if you're looking to present, or if you're looking for a topic and you want someone else to present, do this call for speakers and let them know. They have loads of sessions to fill, so I much rather see too many sessions to choose from than not enough. So pass out that URL and spread the word. And with that, I'm going to pass off to Joel. Joel here is also local to Colorado, and he's been an MVP for several years, and he has been in this space since Exacta 2.5. So that's quite a little while there. And with that, Joel, and my super fast talking, I'm going to pass off to you.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for having me today, and thanks everyone for joining us. I should be able to see my screen momentarily.
And just as a reminder, folks, you are all able to unmute and talk. You are also able to throw your questions in the chat window. So however you'd like to communicate with Joel or myself, use whatever works for you. If you unmute and you've got a bunch of noise in the background and you forget to turn yourself off, I will have to turn you off. But hopefully we'll get some good questions. Joel, I see your PowerPoint's just fine.
All right, great. Yeah, and as Julie said, feel free to throw out your questions as you have them, or throw them in the chat and Julie will read them out loud. You know, operations is a big topic, so I did my best to cover a lot of ground, and I'm going to try to demo as many things as I can, just to give everyone a flavor of what's possible in operations. As Julie mentioned, I'm Joel Lichty. Here's my contact information and my Twitter handle. I work for a company called SA Global, and we specialize for professional services customers. So to start off with, I wanted to try and talk a little bit about how Dynamics 365 kind of fits within the overall, or how the product family fits together, and how operations fits into how I see the product family. First of all, if everyone on this call drew these boxes, I'm pretty confident that we'd all draw them in different sizes and shapes and colors. And, so take it all with a grain of salt, because this is my very rough interpretation. And especially because my expertise is in operations. And so how I drew the CRM boxes is more based on perception than experience. But what I wanted to show is, first of all, from a platform and a development perspective, the operations and talent and retail, are obviously have a different history from a development perspective than the CRM side of it. So I tried to draw those in kind of two different colors just to point out that there's different technology stacks that are running for each one. Talent up here on the left, has some overlap with operations because operations originally had an HR module. They basically took that HR module, made a copy of it, and turned it into this talent product. So it kind of stands alone, but it's got, the same kind of history, let's say, as operations, which is why I colored it similarly as the operations. But it is different now because the talent now is a true SaaS product. How it gets managed. There is no development experience, for example, in talent other than adding on Power Apps. So it is a true SaaS product that kind of is on its own path at this point. Obviously, on the CRM side, we've got, things like sales and customer service that have overlap with operations because there's similar things you can do in both, such as quoting, ordering, master file management. There's certainly some overlap in those areas. Operations actually had its own entire CRM module and probably still has many of the components of that old CRM module as well. But most people who are, really serious about CRM anymore are moving to, the CRM product and not really using operations for that purpose. You've got marketing and customer insights, which I don't understand at all. So I have no idea if this box is even close to being right. PSA we specialize in. From a PSA perspective, there's pretty much 100% overlap with the functionality that's available in PSA versus the functionality that's in operations. There's not, some of the functionality is a little bit different, but at its core, anything you can do in PSA currently exists in operations. Field service, kind of similar, but a little bit less overlap on the operations side with the service module in operations. And then we have our favorite thing here, common data service. I've got the unicorn because my joke is always that anytime there's a problem in any of these products, somebody just says common data service and then that problem magically gets fixed. But I think the vision for common data service is that there's more overlap, right? I mean, the vision that gets presented is that this box is like kind of sitting in the middle of all this stuff and the applications are sitting on top of it. But I wanted to draw that attention to it on the slide that that's not really how it exists, especially from an aspect of like centrally managing your business master file records, like workers and customers and vendors and products. Those things really aren't baked into all these products this way, so that there's centralized management, and then any of these Dynamics 365 applications that you go into, the data just shows up. That's kind of been the vision that's been presented, but not exactly the vision that's been executed to this point. So it's still kind of off to the side in terms of storing that business data. And, of course, those connect to the other kind of stack, including Power Apps and Flow and all that side of the house can connect to the common data service. So that's, again, my perception of kind of the product family and the relative size of all these different applications.
So Joel, are you able to see the chat?
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you able to see the chat window?
I'm not looking at the chat.
Okay,
no.
Well, the feedback is that the unicorn on this slide is very appropriate for CDS. Okay. And also that finally a chart where the size of the boxes make more sense.
That was
So,
my main goal.
yep,
Yes.
we're following along and we're all in agreement so far.
Yeah. It makes me laugh when they put like the PSA size the same size as the operations box. I just kind of shake my head and I'm like, no, that's not even close to reality. Um, so just talking about, okay, well, what is in operations? And frankly, I didn't even list all the modules in on this slide. So these are probably the most commonly used modules. So you have your financial management for accounting nerds like myself, to manage all of your payables and receivables and general ledger. Human resources, which again, I don't think long term is really going to be part of operations. So they made a copy of it, they turned it into talent. It still exists in operations. You can still use it. But I think long term, obviously, Microsoft doesn't want to be managing two HR products. So we'll see that move over to talent. You can run your payroll inside of operations. Um, Most people don't. That's another example of something that most people will go to a third party provider to manage the payroll, but some companies do use it. I can have my vendors log into operations to enter things like vendor invoices and requests for quotes and POs and those kind of artifacts. So I can, yeah, use my system as a portal for my vendors. Of course, we have all the inventory related things that you can do to, manage your inventory, manage your warehouse. The inventory then kind of ties into the retail module. I showed it on the last slide. There's some of the retail stuff is like baked inside of operations, but then there's some separate apps because you need retail apps for actually running the retail terminals. So that's kind of the separate app when it comes to retail. Project management and service management, which, covers some of the same ground as PSA does in CRM and the field service module does in CRM, but has more than both. Well, so especially on the project management side, which I'm very familiar with, a lot more functionality in operations than what's available in PSA. And then an expense portal for managing like travel expenses is also available. So those are all the ones I listed. There's more things that are not as popular, like cost accounting and questionnaire and organizational management. So, at the end of the day, the idea is, that you can basically run anything in operations that you want. That was kind of the old model, although now, obviously Microsoft is trying to pull certain features out like HR, like the old CRM related features that were in operations. They're trying to pull those out and just have them in the individual apps to tell a better Dynamics 365 story. Okay, I wanted to go through just a few things on the UI that I think are interesting about operations, starting with the workspaces. So I'm just going to jump over. I'll start at this is the home page for operations. So all of these workspaces are essentially a grouping of tasks that a person would normally do together. I feel like this credit and collections is a really good example of what's possible with a workspace, so I'm going to use that one as my example today. But the objective of a workspace is to have your tasks kind of collected together and have a one-click to action kind of experience is sort of the sales sentence around the workspaces. So, in this case, I've got lots of things related to collection activities where I can just jump into these tiles and the tiles are indicating how many of each type of record I have to go deal with. So kind of an inbox experience for this collection of tasks. I can have some visualizations on my workspace that make me jump into other places in the application where I could potentially, get into doing more work. I can have kind of these list pages that give me some kind of list, like a list of customers or a list of cases or whatever, and then give me some of the key buttons from that form so that I can just more quickly jump into different experiences inside the application. And then over here on the right, I've got just additional, less frequently used links to other places in the application. And at the top, I can have a series of buttons for adding new business data to the application. So that's kind of the concept of a workspace at its whole. These are new in Dynamics 365. They're a totally new concept, and I like them. I like that it kind of, operations, because it has so many things going on, can get really complicated from a UI perspective, and I feel like the Workspaces simplifies some of these forms for new users. The other thing that we have that's possible with the operations is embedding Power BI into the Workspaces. So in this case, I've got that via an Analytics tab. And so this is Power BI that's just embedded right inside of operations and basically pulling data from operations into this report. These embedded experiences do take, quite a bit of development to, both design and, develop the workspace. It's more of a development experience, so let's say, than a power user experience to do one of these embedded workspaces. But with this technology, just like you can drill down from the other graph that I showed, you can drill down from these embedded workspaces as well. Task guides are one of the killer features, I think, of operations. Task guides basically let you record a specific process, and then a user can play that recording back as basically a training manual. So I'm just going to find a very simplistic form, and we're going to just go through that whole task recording process. So I click on the settings bar, go to a task recorder, create a new recording. We'll do a customer group recording. Click start, and now I just go through my normal process. So I'm going to find that customer group menu item. And you can see over here on the right, it started recording what I should do. So now I'll create a new one. And save that, close the form. I could do some editing experience in here as well. So for example, maybe in the description field, it's going to propose just a generic description by default, but I can also provide more detail and context if I want to. So we'll say enter a good description in this case. So I can do that both for the help text, the text that shows above the help text, and then you'll see this all when we play it back, but then there's some, you can even kind of write some additional paragraphs about a specific field. Okay, so we edited our task guide. It's it's the way we want it to be. So I'll just stop the recording. I can upload it to LCS to like have a library that's available inside the help system and operations. In this case, I'm just going to save it locally to my computer. And so now as a user, I would come back in. Normally, I would just click the help box, and if I save it to LCS, I can have the task guide show up here in the help box. But in this case, I'm going to play it back. So I'm going to play the recording as a guide. I'm going to open it from my local computer. And we will find the one I just did. And then say open task guide and start. So now it's going to start giving me this box with the instructions that I recorded. So it's telling me that here you need to go to, this specific menu item that you selected. So we'll go to sales and marketing and setup. Prospects and customer groups. And now that I did that successfully, it's going to tell me step by step how I'm supposed to do this. So I need to fill in this field. I made all these edits. So the edits you can see are in here. So I put some text on the task guide. I put some work instructions, and then again, I could have additional information if the user wanted to see a bunch of information about what's the right thing to put in this field. Okay, so it tells me to click save, tells me to close the page, and now my task guide is done. It's going to kind of bring me back to the base level here. So I think this is a really interesting technology that we have available in operations from a training perspective. And yeah, it's one of the coolest features inside of operations. So you got a chance to see some of the application with the screen I just showed. I will show a little more and point out some different components of the application. Most of the time this is going to look very familiar to CRM in terms of organizing things into lists. You can click into a details page. In the details page, typically everything's organized into these fast tabs, which is just a series of fields that are grouped together on these tabs. Sometimes it's fields on the table you're on. Sometimes it's adding information to a related table. There are fact boxes on the right-hand side where you can have some additional kind of quick view information related to the customer. And we've got the ribbon bar at the top, which should look very similar to the Office style experience, where I've got a bunch of buttons that take me to different places inside the application and let me process different functionality. One of the components that we can do in operations is personalize the experience. So here on the options tab, there's a form for personalization. And when I let's see here. Okay, we'll go on the tab that's active. When I click on a field, it's giving me additional options for what I want to do inside this field. So I can hide fields I don't like. I can include it kind of at a summary level at the top here. I can make it so I'm not allowed to edit this field so I don't forget and overwrite data that I shouldn't have. And in some cases where I'm trying to use keyboard shortcuts for really fast data entry, I can skip over that field when I click tab. So a lot of different options, both at a field level. Actually, I could pretty much get these same options with any sort of object on the screen. So I can hide a field, I can hide a group of fields, I can hide an entire fast tab. You can kind of see that different things are getting highlighted, and these settings would apply to different things that I'm doing here. I can also add fields. I can manage my personalizations by importing and exporting them. And yeah, these are the same options that I just showed. So some different ways that at a user level, I can make the application more relevant to myself as a user, and put in the fields I care about most front and center. I wanted to mention that there's kind of three different models, and this maybe covers, I don't know CRM well enough to talk about the personalization story, but you can kind of group things into three different levels. Personalization might be just for at a user level for one individual user. Customization is something that you could probably change via the UI, but applies to more than just one user. And then obviously we have development, which is I'm writing code and promoting the code and doing all that through the developer tools. So operations has always been the strongest in personalization and development. Those are the areas that they've really focused on. One of the things that's happening now is they're taking some of this personalization stuff and giving additional deployment options, right? So now I can take a personalization that I just did and deploy it to an entire group of users, or if you're in a specific security role, I can apply that personalization to anyone in a security role. So they're kind of taking that personalization concept that's always been around in AX or operations and a little bit moving it more into the customization model, where I can sort of have a super user administering these changes, but still not having to use the development tools to make the changes. I think as the way I understand it is CRM has always been a lot stronger in sort of the customization area, where that's sort of the CRM model, that I'm making these changes, but sort of deploying them to everyone, but making the changes through the UI. The final thing I wanted to just touch on a little bit was data management. There's an entire module inside of operations for managing the import and export of data, and copying legal entities across, importing and exporting things for data conversion. So we have all these tools available for those types of activities. I'm going to just show one specific tool related to data management, which is the Excel add-in. So we do have the option on a lot of different forms. In this case, the customer form, I can click on this Office button, and I can open my entity in Excel. And it's going to load up this Dynamics add-in and log me into the application. And it's basically using OData to connect this Excel add-in back to the system that I just came from. So in a second here, it's going to retrieve a bunch of information, and then it's going to basically populate my list of customers inside Excel. And as part of this, I can then actually make updates. So, maybe I want to update the credit limit field and, change the customer from whatever that high number was. Wow, $600 million. All right. Uh, so I changed the credit limit, click on publish, and now it's going to use this add-in to go publish the data back to operations.
So, Joel, we have a question from Simon. He wants to know if
Sure.
you could talk about legal entities, companies, and the global address list or address book.
Sure.
So if it's already in your planned talk, just keep going.
Nope, it wasn't.
Okay, but it is now.
Yeah, so so legal entities are a concept where, I mean, they're pretty much an accounting concept, right? Because accounting wise, I have uh, I have to organize my companies legally into different legal entities. So when I incorporate my company somewhere, I end up with a legal entity, and that's basically how the system gets modeled for the most part. There's a little bit of complexity there where sometimes you can use, a concept of a business unit like you have in CRM as a legal entity in operations. That's more complicated than what I want to get into today. So, but it does, yeah, there is some flexibility in this. But a lot of times you'll have, legal entities have to be tracked in a specific currency, when there's different companies. Those are cases where you have to have different legal entities. So if I have a Canadian entity and a US entity, I have to have two legal entities set up in operations, because one of them I'm going to track all of my postings in Canadian dollars and the other one in US dollars. And then there was a question about the global address book. So a lot of the tables that you'll see inside of operations just relate to the legal entity that you're logged into. So like in this case, I'm looking at a customer list for the USMF company. If I look at the USSI company, then I'm going to see an entirely different list of customers. So the data is very much segregated by legal entity in many cases. What happens then in operations is there's certain concepts then that go back and sort of span the legal entity concept. So we have some tables in operations that they make global and that can apply to any legal entity. And so the questioner asked about the global address book. That's just an example of one of those concepts. So whereas a customer relates to a specific legal entity, the global address book is just probably what you would call accounts in CRM, because this is just anybody who I have a relationship with. So I might see, you can even see in this list, I mean, I've got customers, I've got workers, I've got vendors, all of those different concepts are listed out in the global address book. And that way, when the advantage of this kind of structure is then if I have, the same customer in 5 different legal entities, but it's really one customer, I can do things like manage their address or manage their contact information because they're all joined to this same global address book record. Any other questions in the queue?
We've got actually a couple coming in. Can you say
Okay.
a few words on the way operations typically is configured to prevent us from running business processes with incomplete or invalid input up front in comparison to cleaning up data after it has been submitted?
No, but I'll try.
Okay, and then let me give you another one so that
Okay,
if they relate together at all.
sure.
So then the following question, so data like customers in finance and operation are completely separate from accounts in CRM.
I missed the first couple of words in there, so say it one more time.
Data like customers in finance and operations are completely separate from accounts in CRM. I think I can probably answer that one that
Yes.
yes.
That's the common data service unicorn, right? I
Yes.
mean, they're
Yep.
two separate things. There are theoretically ways that you can tie them together, but by default, they don't just everything doesn't just magically get shared. That's what we'd all like to see, but that's not what's happening today. Going back to the validation question, I mean, to some extent, there's lots of fields in operations that are sort of user definable dropdowns. So I showed the example of the customer group earlier. That's a validated field in terms of I can't just enter whatever customer group I want. There's some other fields like this ABC code that's, a system defined list that you define via the developer tools that you can't change just through the UI. So there is validation from that perspective of, there's many fields that you have to pick from a list. You can't just put whatever you want, like the country field. I don't know if it's still like this in CRM, but I've noticed in the past that you can just kind of enter whatever country you want. That's not something you could do in operations. It's going to, be a validated field that's coming from a list of countries. So, but if you're talking about, there's kind of another level of validation, like, I don't know, if I put in customer group 20, then, I have to put in a credit limit or something like that. Those types of rules, you'd really have to do through the development tools. There's no kind of out of the box way to make sure that users aren't entering weird things from that perspective.
So can you have a look at the chat panel and address the
Sure.
questions? There's a handful of them coming in.
Sure. Okay, there's a question about the global address book. If a customer and vendor can kind of share the same address book record. The global address book, you can have, it's not just across legal entities. You can have, for example, an employee can share the same global address book record as a vendor, because a lot of times I have to reimburse my vendors for expenses. So I set them up as both, but they can be linked together. So there's lots of scenarios where the global address book is kind of linking this data together to help me manage the business data. A question about legal entity being similar to organization in CE. It's pretty reasonable to assume that legal entity is similar to organization in customer engagement. In general, you may have many organizations that map to one legal entity. So for example, maybe I have a company USSI, but I have, East and West regions within USSI. You might model that in customer engagement as East and West. In operations, we would have to have both attributes. We would need both the USSI attribute and the attribute that defines East and West. So we kind of always have to take it one level deeper. We do have in operations, I'll just point out, we literally have a business unit table. So we have this concept of operating units where I can have, an attribute of business unit. So we have this same thing where this more closely probably maps to what customer engagement is. But again, I'm always having to use some combination. I have to use legal entity. If I want to use this kind of business unit, then I need to use a combination of legal entity and business unit inside of operations. Oh, I lost my chat window. Let's see. Tommy's helping out in the chat. Thank you, Tommy. And okay, someone asked, what's the difference between business and enterprise? So at a really high level, business edition is Navision, and enterprise is what AX used to be. So I didn't draw it on my complicated set of boxes in the first tab, but basically, you know, if you can think of business as being something that's an entirely different color than everything else because it's Navision. Does legal entity equal company? Yes. Legal entity and company are used interchangeably in the accounting world. I don't know that I would really put any distinction between. There's probably a legal distinction between legal entity and company. Like legal entity is literally something that you're incorporating, and company is how you represent the legal entities inside of operations. I'm going to talk about development in a little bit. And yeah, if we want to get into development, I'm almost there. I wanted to make a quick note because in operations, you may have heard about lifecycle services. So lifecycle services is a tool for helping us manage the environments and deployment of Dynamics 365 environments and code and business processes. So I'm just going to show it real briefly, just so kind of familiar that it exists and what it's doing. So I'm logged in here to lcs.dynamics.com. I'm actually in my company tenant, so I've already gone ahead and gone into a specific a demo project basically that I have. So normally this would be like an implementation project for a customer is what you would be seeing in this inside this project. And then there's a number of different things that you can do in here. I don't have time today to get into all the details of what you can do, but I'll just cover the highlights of some of the most important things. So one of the most important things is the environments. So this is how I'm deploying like dev, test, production environments, both for, you know, for a customer implementation, or if I just want to deploy a, you know, any Azure environment, I can do it here through LCS. The business process modeler is a tool that at a really high level, let's just say it stores your task guides. So I kind of have this business process structure in here where I can organize all my business processes, and then I can attach my task guides in here. And that's how I get them to show up inside the application, because they're actually pulling that information from LCS. There's some project management features that Microsoft has kind of built in here, but they're not great. So task guides are probably the biggest thing that this gets used for. I can search for issues in LCS. So if there's any hot fixes available that I want to find, I can look for, you know, use the issue search to find those things. I can submit a case to Microsoft from LCS. So this is basically my portal for doing new cases. And then it's thinking. And then the last thing I wanted to just mention is the asset library, because this is where I can store a lot of different types of files that I end up deploying to my environment. But the most common ones are this data package. No, sorry. Everything's called package in operations. The software package. So this is where I have a spot to basically upload my compiled code, and then I can deploy it to my environments from LCS. So probably the biggest thing about LCS is the environment management side of things, that this is where I'm going to deploy environments, manage the code that's going into those environments, etc. Again, I didn't cover everything, but that's pretty much the greatest hits of LCS. I got a slide here for the topology of operations. So in the middle here, we have our SQL database storing all of our transactions, and then a number of different ways to get data in and out of that transactional database. So right here on the right, I've kind of got listed that this is the Microsoft firewall. So we can't really see anything to the left of this red arrow or this red bar. Anything to the left is stuff that Microsoft is managing. Anything to the right is things that we can manage from a partner or customer perspective. So obviously they're, as part of just typical SQL, all the data is getting replicated. I just mentioned that because for performance reasons, you can sometimes run certain reports off of that replicated database. Microsoft has something called the Entity Store, which I showed the Power BI embedded experience earlier, and there's actually a separate database for how they store the data related to those embedded Power BI experiences. They're not actually pulling them live from the transactional database. There's a tool that used to be called Management Reporter, and now it's just called Financial Reports for doing like board quality, presentable financial statements. So your income statement, balance sheet, statement of cash flows, all the things from Accounting 101. This is a specialized reporting tool for generating those documents. Continuing here, the OData, that's one example. OData is the Excel add-in I just showed, right? So I got data out of the system and I pushed data back into the system using that Excel add-in. Flow is also built on OData. I know CRM has a lot of OData components as well. And then there's some more reporting scenarios because a lot of times I want to extract data. Maybe I want to combine data from operations and CRM and talent into one kind of reporting database. So there's some tools in the data management framework to get the data out of operations into a SQL database. So that's kind of the high level topology of what we're working with from a database perspective. I wanted to show this slide. So from a development perspective, a lot of the, AX developers and partners and customers have had to go through a pretty significant transformation in the last couple of years in terms of how we organize our code. So it used to be in AX 2012, we basically had access to 100% of the source code and we could modify whatever we wanted. So we could modify a standard Microsoft class in the middle of a method. If we didn't like, the way it was working, we could change it. Or if we needed it to work a different way, we could just change the core application. It's a really appealing thing from a sales perspective and how you can deliver the application. But when it came to upgrading, it was not a very good story. Because then, Microsoft makes a change and breaks all your customizations during an upgrade. So we've gone through this transformation where now, everybody kind of owns their code in their own package. And if you can extend to other packages, so you can extend Microsoft's standard code, and that extension technology is pretty broad in terms of what you can do. But you do have to kind of organize your code now into your own packages so that we have a much better story around upgrading than we had in the past. So you can think of extensions are pretty much like APIs. But, we can do other things like, add fields to a table or add fields to a form, or those types of changes can be done as well through this extension model. So my understanding of CRM is you've been on the box on the right for a long time. So this is probably just, duh, why wouldn't you do it this way? But I wanted to point it out because, you've got, if you're dealing with customers who are on AX 2012 or AX 2009, like there's a learning curve to get all the code into this new model. And the code upgrade is not simple between these two versions because you have to sort of unwind everything and move it all to this new model. And actually, with the release that's coming out in April, this is even more true than it ever was, because that's the release where we're not allowed to do this at all. So for the last couple of years, we've been allowed to do it a little bit, and now in this 2018 release, the spring release, no more overlayering Microsoft code. You have to get all your code out into extensions. So, and then on the development side, so the technology we use is to develop through Visual Studio. So we have like developer virtual machines that we spin up and use Visual Studio Team Services to host the source code that gets changed. Operations has its own proprietary language, and if you write code in C#, you'll basically recognize the language. It's just its own language, I think, more so because it's more restricted than what you could possibly do with C#. So you don't have access to any of like the generic Windows APIs that you might have access to in C# aren't there using X++. This is also a big change from earlier versions. So earlier versions, this entire SDK was just baked into the application. And then in Dynamics 365, they finally moved it to Visual Studio and broke out all of this customization technology in a proper, Visual Studio methodology. And then I mentioned the extension technology in the last slide, but again, they kind of have a list of some of the things that you can change using that extension technology. So the list I have is not exhaustive. There's more things that can be changed, and there's certainly gotchas even within the list that I have here. But we can still do quite a bit of customization with the new technology. There are a lot of things that you can, change and override and make the application work the way you want it to, which is an important story for ERP because, a lot of times, yes, we're trying to get a customer to use a fairly standard approach to operations. But the reality is, everybody's business runs different and everybody has their own kind of requirements. And sometimes they just want the system to fit their business requirements. And so I think this new model that we have with Dynamics 365 is a pretty good middle ground from what we had before to, maybe some other systems that you'll run into like NetSuite or whatever might be more limited in the changes you can make and the API calls that you can make, whereas operations still pretty wide open in terms of, all the things that you can possibly change. I'm trying to catch up on the questions here. I don't know if there's, I know Tommy's been helping. Thank you, Tommy. Tommy's actually a fellow MVP who runs the Dynamics podcast. So I'll give him a shout out and definitely check out Dynamics podcast if you want to learn on specific topics, a grab bag of topics related to operations. Tommy's podcast is excellent. Tommy, you're not allowed to ask questions. What?
So can you tell me a little bit about the Power BI story with operations?
Yeah, dang it. Um, yeah, I mean, I showed the let's see here. I showed the Power BI embedded story, which is basically I'm using the SDK to get the data out of my transactional database. I'm getting it into this, Microsoft managed reporting database, and then I can build those embedded experiences on top of that reporting database. But this is the only tool I can use to build experiences on top of the reporting database. If I want to build things on powerbi.com, I really need to use this other arrow and this other approach to extract all my data out. And then I can either use the powerbi.com import, or I could, for example, use a more Azure technology to put a cube on top of it and then report using powerbi.com on that data. So it kind of depends on which one you're wanting to go with. I would say this one in the top right corner is a lot more common. It's probably easier to get started with, where you can just get all your data out of the Microsoft firewall and really look at your data and explore your data and get it all figured out. And it's easier to make changes on powerbi.com than it is with this embedded story. So that's probably the default position for most companies, is to get this data extracted and then use powerbi.com as the front end. Um, Question about on-prem. So I think middle of last year, operations. So a brief history of on-prem. AX 2012 was almost entirely on-prem. There was a little bit of a cloud story, but it was not really a cloud story. It was more like I can do a bunch of Azure deployments and make this happen. Then we got to Dynamics 365, and for a while it was only cloud. So that was the only option, was to go with the Microsoft Cloud offering. And then last year, they finally came out with the on-premise deployments. And I point that out because really, if you just look at something like this, right, all of this complexity, it takes a lot to deploy all of this stuff. And so the on-prem, they're still kind of refining the story around on-prem to make this simpler. You also get into some of these kind of like firewall issues in terms of, okay, what services can I connect to? There's an entire article on docs.microsoft.com that talks about the things that don't currently work with on-prem. So just an example, I believe, I'm going off memory here, so don't quote me, but I think like Microsoft Flow, I don't think works with on-prem, because the connectivity between your on-prem and the Flow doesn't exist, and therefore, you're not able to use that kind of web service to make the connection. So there's, I think the two major gotchas are, the number of environments and the complication of just deploying the on-prem topology is an issue, and then some of these cloud-based services that we would typically use don't always aren't all supported, let's say, currently for on-prem. So those are the two major things that our customers are running into. I would say, really for SA Global, I think we've had, one customer who had some government requirements to go on-prem, but most of our customers in the professional services space, at least, have been very happy to go to the cloud and have Microsoft manage all this stuff. So I think it's very industry specific. You'll ask other people in different industries and different locations, and they don't agree with they would give a different answer to that story. But yeah, that's been our experience, is that most people are happy with the cloud offering. And Microsoft's trying really hard to make the cloud offering cheaper than on-prem. So you're really doing on-prem not to save money, but you're doing it for, legal requirements or other requirements like that.
So can you show us your contact slide one more time?
Sure.
I think we are about ready to wrap up. I do appreciate you joining us and getting us this rescheduled. We've got one last question that I'll let you answer, and then and Tom, you can't talk about GDPR. That's a whole separate conversation out of scope. But you do have one more question in there, Joel. What 365 will be the future with 365? What will be the future of AX R3 2012? Is that a loaded question?
Well, I mean, I think the life cycle, I don't know what the exact date is. The life cycle of 2012 has been announced and it'll go away.
Yep, I would imagine that you could probably see more details about that at roadmap.dynamics.com.
Yeah,
That's
it's
that's a good place to start.
yes, it's somewhere on docs. I don't know exactly where it is, but somewhere it lists all of the life cycle for all of the different versions. But I think at this point, with the on-prem coming out, there's no question that it's going to be, Dynamics 365 going forward. That's where Microsoft is going to put their investments.
Right. We've had some pretty good prescriptive guidance from the top that we're moving forward at a fast pace. So keep up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things about this whole extension story is AX and earlier versions of operations haven't put people in a good position to keep up because I keep having to mess around with my code. I manage a product. We just tested it out with version 8, and I think we ran into like 2 compile errors on our, when we upgraded, and we have a pretty extensive product. So, it definitely simplifies this story, and hopefully will get even better going forward to keep people on later versions.
So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end our recording. I'll go ahead and post this hopefully later on today. And thank you so much for your time, Joel. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Julie.